Betrayal often wears the mask of a friendly favor. When a struggling single father was lured into a humiliating blind date by his own friends, they expected a spectacular public disaster. They completely miscalculated. The frail woman in the wheelchair across the table wasn't a burden. She was a billionaire. David Miller stared blankly at the mounting pile of final notices scattered across his cramped kitchen counter. As a single father to 7-year-old Lily, his life had devolved into a relentless tightrope walk over an abyss of financial ruin. Once a promising structural architect, David had lost everything 2 years ago when his former firm folded during an economic downturn. Shortly after, his wife walked out, unwilling to trade their comfortable suburban lifestyle for budget meals and a tiny, drafty apartment in the city's lower-income district. Since then, David had been surviving on freelance drafting gigs and grueling shifts at a local hardware store, sacrificing every ounce of his pride just to keep the heat on and ensure Lily had food on her plate. His phone buzzed, shattering the quiet of the apartment. It was Gregory Hodges, a former college acquaintance who had always reveled in passive-aggressive superiority. Gregory was a mid-level manager at a prominent real estate firm, a man who wore expensive suits and possessed a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "David, my man!" Gregory's voice boomed through the receiver, dripping with artificial warmth. "I know things have been incredibly tight for you lately, but I got something that could change your luck." A networking opportunity disguised as a dinner date. David hesitated, his brow furrowing. "A date? Gregory, I haven't been on a date since the divorce. I don't have the time or the money for that, let alone a babysitter." "Don't worry about the cost. It's completely on me," Gregory insisted smoothly. "Listen, a very wealthy client of mine has a cousin. She's had a rough go of it. She's wheelchair-bound, a bit isolated, and desperately needs some company. If you'll go out with her, show her a good time, my client will be so grateful he'll personally review your architectural portfolio for an upcoming commercial project. It's a guaranteed foot in the door, David. Just one night. Desperation is a powerful motivator. The thought of finally securing a stable job, of buying Lily the new winter coat she desperately needed, overshadowed David's deep unease. He agreed, completely unaware that he was stepping directly into a trap designed entirely for cruel entertainment. Across the city, in the sprawling, sterile penthouse of a glass and steel skyscraper, Victoria Kensington sat motionless by floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the glittering streetlights below. At 32, Victoria was the sole heir and CEO of Kensington Global, a multi-billion-dollar empire spanning real estate, tech logistics, and urban development. She was brilliant, ruthless in the boardroom, and fiercely independent. But 2 years ago, a catastrophic pileup on the interstate had shattered her spine, leaving her permanently paralyzed from the waist down. While her mind remained as sharp as a diamond, her extended family saw her physical vulnerability as an opportunity. Leading the pack of vultures was her step-cousin, Richard Belmont. Richard was the vice president of acquisitions, a man whose ambition was vastly disproportionate to his actual competence. He deeply resented taking orders from a woman in a wheelchair and had been subtly campaigning to the board of directors to have her removed on the grounds of declining mental and physical health. Richard needed Victoria to look weak, desperate, and unstable. Under the guise of familial concern, he had incessantly pressured her to re-enter the dating scene, claiming it would improve her public image. Exhausted by his relentless nagging, and secretly battling her own profound loneliness, Victoria finally agreed to a blind date he arranged. Richard promised he had found a highly successful, empathetic executive who was perfectly comfortable with her disability. In reality, Richard conspired with his subordinate, Gregory Hodges. The plan was wicked in its simplicity, matched the untouchable billionaire CEO with a broke, desperate, washed-up single dad. Richard intended to have the entire disastrous evening photographed. He wanted to document Victoria being paraded around with a penniless loser, leaking the story to the tabloids to humiliate her and prove to the shareholders that her judgment was fundamentally compromised. On the evening of the date, David stood outside the frosted glass doors of the Obsidian Room, one of the most exclusive and intimidatingly expensive restaurants in the city. He pulled nervously at the collar of his only suit of 5-year-old navy two-piece that had seen better days. Taking a deep breath, he pushed through the doors, stepping into a world of hushed jazz, crystal chandeliers, and patrons wearing garments that cost more than his annual rent. The madre directed David to a secluded, dimly lit corner booth. There, bathed in the soft glow of a candlelight, sat Victoria. David stopped in his tracks, momentarily stunned. Gregory had described a pathetic, needy woman. The woman before him was breathtaking. She wore an understated but exquisitely tailored emerald green dress that brought out the sharp, intelligent glint in her dark eyes. Her posture was impeccably straight, radiating an aura of quiet, formidable authority. Beside her, seamlessly integrated into the table's space, was a sleek, custom-built carbon fiber wheelchair. "Hi," David said, finding his voice as he stepped forward. "I'm David. It's a genuine pleasure to meet you." Victoria looked him up and down. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, not the slight fraying at the cuffs of his suit, not the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, and certainly not the fact that he was entirely out of his depth in this restaurant. So, she thought bitterly, this is the successful executive Richard promised. Another one of her cousin's cruel jokes. She prepared herself for an evening of awkward pity or thinly veiled disgust. "Victoria," she replied, her tone cool and measured. She intentionally did not offer her last name, waiting to see how quickly he would make an excuse and flee. "Please, sit." David slid into the booth. He didn't stare at her wheelchair. He didn't offer a sad, sympathetic tilt of his head. Instead, he looked directly into her eyes, offering a warm, slightly nervous smile that reached all the way to the creases of his eyes. "I have to confess," David said softly, picking up the heavy linen napkin, "I haven't been on a blind date in over a decade. If I accidentally use the wrong fork or say something incredibly stupid, I hope you'll grant me a little grace." Victoria blinked, caught off guard by his immediate, disarming vulnerability. There was no posturing, no attempt to project a false aura of wealth or success. "I think I can manage that, David," she said, a tiny, almost imperceptible fraction of the ice in her voice melting. The trap was fully set in a private alcove across the restaurant, concealed by heavy velvet drapery. Richard Belmont and Gregory Hodges sat with expensive scotch in hand, eagerly watching the table. A private photographer was stationed near the bar, lens-focused, waiting for the inevitable moment the broke architect would embarrass the billionaire, completely unaware that they had just set the stage for their own ultimate destruction. The first course arrived delicate scallops, seared to perfection, and with it the heavy tension at the table began to miraculously dissipate. Victoria, who was accustomed to men either treating her as an invalid made of spun glass or a stepping stone to corporate power, found herself genuinely captivated by David. He didn't patronize her. When the waiter condescendingly asked David what the lady would like to drink, completely bypassing Victoria, David didn't answer for her. Instead, he simply turned his head, looked at Victoria, and waited respectfully for her to speak for herself. It was a microscopic gesture, but to a woman who constantly had to fight to be seen past her wheelchair, it spoke volumes. "Gregory mentioned you were in real estate," Victoria noted smoothly, testing the waters. "Is that where you dedicate your time?" David let out a soft, self-deprecating chuckle. "Gregory has a habit of embellishing. I'm an architect by trade, but lately I've been doing whatever it takes to keep the lights on. Drafting, contracting, even a little retail. The economy hasn't been kind to my sector, and when you have a little girl relying on you, pride is the first thing you have to let go of." Victoria's gaze intensified. "You have a daughter." David's face instantly transformed. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a radiant, undeniable warmth. "Lily, she's 7. She wants to be an astronaut and a dinosaur paleontologist simultaneously." She's the smartest, bravest person I know. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, showing Victoria a picture of a little girl with missing front teeth wearing a handmade cardboard space helmet. Victoria felt a strange tightening in her chest. The corporate sharks she dealt with daily would never admit to financial struggles, nor would they speak with such unbridled, tender devotion about their children. She's beautiful, David. It sounds like she has a wonderful father. I do my best, David sighed, putting the phone away. My dream is to eventually open my own firm. I've been developing designs for sustainable, affordable housing units. High-density, low-impact structures designed specifically for single-parent families. Spaces that foster community but respect privacy. But, well, investors aren't exactly lining up to fund a guy who currently works weekends at a hardware store. Victoria leaned forward, her analytical mind immediately engaging. What kind of materials are you factoring into the low-impact models? Are you utilizing modular prefabricated framing? Or are you looking at cross-laminated timber for the primary load-bearing elements? David stared at her, genuinely shocked. Cross-laminated timber, actually. It significantly reduces the carbon footprint and assembly time. How did you know that? I have a passing interest in urban development, Victoria replied, a ghost of a smirk playing on her lips. For the next hour they didn't talk about his poverty or her paralysis. They talked about zoning laws, material stress tests, and the psychology of architectural space. David was brilliant. His ideas were innovative, grounded in reality, and deeply compassionate. Victoria realized with stunning clarity that Richard hadn't just set her up with a loser. Richard had, in his sheer ignorance, introduced her to a diamond in the rough. As dessert was cleared away, the atmosphere between them felt remarkably intimate. David was laughing at a dry, witty remark Victoria had made about municipal permits, when a loud, obnoxious voice shattered the moment. Well, 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 look who it is! David's smile vanished. He turned to see Gregory Hodges strutting toward their table, closely followed by a tall, sleekly dressed man with a cruel smirk, Richard Belmont. Gregory. David stood up, confused. What are you doing here? Gregory laughed, a loud grating sound that drew the attention of nearby tables. Just checking in on my little charity project. I see you brought out the good suit, Dave. Didn't know moths had such expensive taste. Richard stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Victoria with malicious triumph. Victoria, darling, you look positively radiant. I hope my friend Gregory's little handyman hasn't been boring you to tears. I told you I'd find someone desperate enough to keep you company. The blood drained from David's face as the horrifying reality of the situation crashed over him. The networking opportunity, the grateful client, it was all a lie. He looked at Victoria, whose hands were gripping the armrests of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles were stark white. You set this up, David said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly quiet. He looked at Gregory. You used my daughter's need for winter clothes to turn me into a prop for a joke. Oh, lighten up, Dave, Gregory sneered, waving a dismissive hand. You got a free meal out of it. And Vicky here got to pretend she's normal for a couple of hours. Everyone wins. Now be a good boy and run along home to your dingy apartment. Richard pulled out his smartphone, clearly intending to snap a humiliating photo of the confrontation. Smile for the board of directors, Victoria. Victoria braced herself for the humiliation, the familiar sting of her family's cruelty. She expected David to walk away in shame. She wouldn't have blamed him. Instead, David stepped out of the booth, positioning his body entirely between Richard's camera lens and Victoria. He didn't shout. He didn't throw a punch. He simply stood there, radiating a quiet, unshakable authority that made Gregory instinctively take a step back. Put the phone away, David commanded. The tone of his voice was like freezing steel. Or what, poor boy? Richard mocked, though his smile wavered. You'll hit me? I'll have you arrested and ruin what's left of your pathetic life. I don't need to hit you to know exactly what kind of man you are, David said evenly. his gaze piercing through Richard. "You wear a $5,000 suit, but you possess the character of a gutter rat. You orchestrated a cruel charade because you are fundamentally terrified of the woman sitting behind me. You look at her and you see a wheelchair, because you are too small-minded and deeply insecure to acknowledge her brilliance. She has more grace and dignity in her little finger than you will ever achieve in your entire miserable life." The dining room had gone completely silent. Diners at adjacent tables were watching, wide-eyed. Richard's face flushed a violent, mottled crimson. David turned his back on the two men, dismissing them entirely, and looked down at Victoria. His eyes were completely devoid of pity, filled only with profound respect. "Victoria," David said gently, extending his hand, "the company here has suddenly become unbearable. Would you do me the honor of allowing me to escort you out?" Victoria stared at the calloused, steady hand offered to her in her entire life of immense wealth and power. Surrounded by sycophants and bodyguards, no one had ever stood up for her like this, asking for absolutely nothing in return. A fierce, unfamiliar spark ignited in her chest. She reached out and placed her hand firmly in his. "I would love that, David." As David expertly navigated her wheelchair past the dumbstruck Gregory and the seething Richard, Victoria made a silent vow. Richard had intended to ruin her night and mock a desperate man. Instead, he had just handed the billionaire CEO of Kensington Global the sharpest, most loyal weapon she could ever ask for. And the revenge she was about to unleash would be absolute. The crisp autumn air hit them as the heavy glass doors of the obsidian room closed behind them. David pushed Victoria's wheelchair down the quiet cobblestone sidewalk, the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly giving way to a profound, hollow exhaustion. He had stood up for his principles, but the reality of his situation remained unchanged. He was still a broke, single father, and Gregory would undoubtedly ensure he never got a drafting contract in this city again. "David," Victoria said quietly, breaking the silence as they reached the corner of the avenue. "Stop here, please." He engaged the brakes on her chair and stepped around to face her. He expected her to call a taxi or perhaps thank him for his intervention before disappearing into the night. Instead, a sleek, armored black Maybach glided silently to the curb beside them. A man in a tailored chauffeur's uniform immediately stepped out, opening the rear door. David blinked, taking a step back. I think your ride is here. I'm incredibly sorry about tonight, Victoria. You deserve much better than being dragged into my so-called friend's twisted game." Victoria looked at him, her expression softening into something remarkably genuine. "David, Gregory, and Richard didn't drag me into your game. They dragged you into mine, and they made a catastrophic miscalculation." She gestured toward the luxury vehicle. "My cousin Richard told you I was a desperate charity case. He omitted my surname. I am Victoria Kensington." The mud was the first thing she truly noticed. Kensington Global was a titan in the urban development sector. They owned half the commercial skyline and were the primary financial backers for municipal infrastructure across the state. The woman he had just defended from a mid-level manager wasn't a helpless victim. She was a billionaire magnate who held the local economy in the palm of her hand. "You're the CEO," David breathed, suddenly acutely aware of his frayed cuffs and the absurdity of his protective stance in the restaurant. "I just tried to shield a woman who could probably buy that restaurant and bulldoze it by tomorrow morning." Victoria laughed, a rich, melodic sound that cut through the tension. "I could, but the food is decent. David, you didn't see my bank account in there. You saw a person being humiliated, and you risked the little you had left to protect my dignity. That is a rare commodity in my world." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a heavy, matte black business card with embossed silver lettering. She handed it to him. "I wasn't lying when I said I was interested in your cross-laminated timber housing project. Bring your blueprints to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." The next morning, David walked into the soaring glass atrium lobby of the Kensington Global headquarters. He carried a battered leather portfolio under his arm, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was ushered past rows of security desks directly to the top floor, where the executive suites overlooked the entire metropolis. Victoria was waiting in her sprawling office, positioned at the head of a massive mahogany conference table. She was flanked by 2 senior architectural engineers. The warmth from the previous night was replaced by a razor-sharp professionalism. "Show us what you have, Mr. Miller," she commanded. For the next 2 hours, David presented his life's work. He detailed the sustainable supply chain, the cost-durability ratios, and the psychological benefits of the high-density family units. He answered brutal, rapid-fire questions from the senior engineers with calm, unshakable expertise. By the time he rolled up his final blueprint, the room was silent. Victoria looked at her head engineer, who gave a slow, impressed nod. She turned her gaze back to David. "Your former firm went bankrupt because of poor financial management, not a lack of talent," Victoria stated firmly. "This design is revolutionary, David. Kensington Global is launching a $200 million urban revitalization initiative next month. I need a lead director of sustainable architecture to oversee it." David's breath hitched. "Are you offering me a job?" "I am offering you a department," Victoria corrected, a dangerous smile touching her lips. "With a 7-figure starting salary, full creative control, and immediate funding for these prototypes. But before you accept, you need to know that my cousin Richard sits on the board. He will try to destroy this project and by extension you." David thought of Lily, of the final notices on his counter, and of the cruel laughter in the restaurant. He looked Victoria directly in the eye, his jaw setting with grim determination. "When do I start?" 2 weeks later, the Kensington Global Executive Boardroom was a theater of corporate warfare. Richard Belmont had called an emergency meeting of the board of directors. He stood at the head of the room, radiating smug competence, projecting a massive, high-definition photograph onto the smartboard. It was the photo taken at the Obsidian Room. David, in his worn suit, standing defensively in front of Victoria's wheelchair. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice dripping with faux concern. "I bring this forward with a heavy heart. As you know, my cousin's tragic accident has taken a severe toll on her. But recently, her judgment has deteriorated to a dangerous degree. She is parading around town with destitute handymen, embarrassing the Kensington name in public venues. This man is a bankrupt, unemployed retail worker. This is not the behavior of a stable CEO." Murmurs rippled through the dozen board members. Richard smiled inwardly. He had them. He was moments away from initiating a vote of no confidence. "Furthermore," Richard pressed, "I have secured an exclusive, highly lucrative contract with Apex Real Estate Holdings, facilitated by their top manager, Gregory Hodges. We need strong, decisive leadership to guide this merger, not a woman compromised by pity projects." The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. Victoria wheeled herself into the room, her presence immediately commanding absolute silence. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her expression carved from ice, and walking directly beside her, wearing a pristine, custom-fitted Tom Ford suit that radiated quiet authority, was David Miller. Richard's smug smile faltered. "Victoria, you're interrupting an executive presentation. And you brought him here." "I am the chief executive officer of this corporation, Richard," Victoria stated, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "I do not interrupt. I arrive. And I brought my new lead director of sustainable architecture to meet his peers." The board members gasped. Richard turned pale. "Lead director? That's impossible. You can't just hire a hardware store clerk for an executive role." Victoria pressed a button on a sleek remote in her hand. The photo of her and David vanished from the smartboard, replaced instantly by a dense, highlighted spreadsheet of financial forensics. "David Miller is a brilliant structural architect whose portfolio I personally vetted alongside our engineering heads." Victoria addressed the board smoothly. "His new housing initiative will increase our municipal subsidies by 40% next quarter. However, while we are on the subject of poor judgment, let's discuss your friend Gregory Hodges and Apex Real Estate Holdings. She pressed the button again. A series of emails and bank transfers illuminated the screen. A forensic audit, which I initiated 10 days ago, reveals that Richard has been funneling corporate funds into shell accounts managed by Gregory Hodges to artificially inflate the value of the Apex merger. You set me up on a humiliating blind date, Richard, hoping to distract the board with a scandal while you committed corporate espionage. The boardroom erupted into chaos. Richard backed away from the screen, stammering, the color draining completely from his face. This is fabricated. You're insane. Security is waiting in the hallway, Victoria said coldly, folding her hands in her lap. You are terminated, Richard, effective immediately. Furthermore, Kensington Global's legal team is currently filing a lawsuit against Apex Real Estate Holdings. Mr. Mustine Hodges will be unemployed and facing federal fraud charges by sunset. As two burly security guards entered to escort a hyperventilating Richard from the premises, Victoria turned to look at David. The architect was watching the destruction of his tormentors with a calm, satisfied silence. The battle was won. 6 months later, the city's skyline was already changing. David stood on the balcony of his new, spacious penthouse, holding 2 mugs of hot coffee. He walked back inside, handing one to Victoria, who was sitting at a massive drafting table reviewing a new set of blueprints. Across the room, Lily was sprawled on a plush rug, wearing a brand-new, bright red winter coat indoors simply because she loved it so much, loudly explaining dinosaur anatomy to Victoria's bewildered but loyal chauffeur. David leaned down, kissing the top of Victoria's head. They had started as a cruel joke orchestrated by toxic men. But in the fires of that humiliation, they had forged an unbreakable empire. The single father had found his footing, and the paralyzed CEO had found a partner who never once looked down on her, only beside him, exactly where she belonged. The trail led them to the ultimate victory. When the dust settled, the arrogant bullies lost everything, and a struggling father built a multi-million-dollar empire alongside the incredible woman they tried to humiliate. True character always wins in the end. Did you love this satisfying story of karma and triumph? Hit that like button, share this incredible twist with your friends, and subscribe for more amazing real-life dramas.